Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us to the Mayfair Investment Club E-Series Talk, the 4th edition. It is Friday, the 8th of May, 2012, 1 p.m. London time. My name is Tatiana Doronina, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Shirley Yu, an economist and a broadcaster. Dr. Yu is a regular contributor across many global media channels. She is an LSE Senior Visiting Fellow, Asia Fellow, the Ash Center, Harvard Kennedy School, Associate of the Lao China Institute and King's College London, and frequently speaks on topics regarding China's political economy and the geopolitical role. The second speaker is Samir Ceric, founder and an executive chairman of the Mayfair Investment Club, and also my co-host for today. Dr. Shirley Yu and Samir Ceric will go head-to-head and discuss the global shifts and order beyond the technology and China's take on it all. The session will last 1 hour. The first part, 30-35 minutes, is dedicated for panelist talks. The second part, 20-25 minutes for Q&A. I would like to encourage you all to ask questions as we want you to be engaged in the discussion. If you're asking questions, please specify either you address it to particular panelists or as a general question to all the panel. If we have too many good questions, we might extend the webinar for 10-15 minutes. And now I pass the word to my co-host, Samir. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana, and welcome everyone to the 4th edition of our E-Series Talks. And I am very, very honored to have Dr. Shirley Yu today as our keynote speaker, and somebody that I've been following for some time now in terms of her being the authority on so many issues relating to China, technology, investment world around the globe. And without further ado, I also wanted to welcome Dr. Shirley Yu on board of the Mayfair Investment Club, and I'm really looking forward to working very closely with her. But now today you are here to really hear her views on where it's all heading, what the current situation is in China regarding technology, but also the broader prospect and concept of the policy making. So I will hand it over to you, Shirley, now.
Thank you, Samir. It's a privilege for me to be here, and thank you for all the viewers who are tuning in at this moment for Mayfair Investment Club's series webinar, and thank you, Tatiana, for the kind introduction. Today, I wanted to bring us to a long view about China's current era of global ambitions and grand strategies, and then I would like to wrap it up into a very contemporary context of the COVID-19 crisis. During the Chinese President Xi Jinping's era, the current Chinese president, China has completely set itself apart from the past 4 decades of foreign policy doctrine of what's called the hide your brightness and bide your time that was initiated by the former Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. So President Xi has adopted a whole new grand strategy for China, characterized under his signature foreign policy under the Belt and Road Initiative. So in 2013, when the BRI was originally launched, it was aimed at connecting continental Eurasia and the maritime Asia Pacific via infrastructure connectivity. I call it the BRI, or Belt and Road Initiative 1.0. It started originally with 66 countries along the region, including China itself. And today, in looking at the BRI mapping, it's covered 130 countries globally. It's covered every continent, including the Arctic region and the Antarctica. So it's gotten the Earth covered. The BRI 2.0, what I call it, is China's digital infrastructure expansion. And you could say that digital infrastructure has always been at the heart of China's Belt and Road ambition. It is in a way more important than the physical infrastructure, the roads, ports that we talk about. It's led by essentially 2 elements. One is China's 5G infrastructure led by Huawei, and the other is China's future multilateral digital currency framework led by the DCEP, the Chinese central bank digital currency. And so I want to talk about why these 2 digital infrastructures are important. Huawei currently runs commercial relationships with about 170 nations globally. It owns the world's largest amount of 5G patents. It's the world's 2nd largest smartphone manufacturer. It singularly has 5 million smartphone users in the UK alone. So Huawei is the de facto leader today in terms of numbers of commercial contracts earned in the 5G space. As of this morning, I just checked the most up-to-date figures on all these corporate websites. And so Huawei itself announced that it owns 91 commercial 5G contracts globally currently, and Ericsson owns 78. Nokia 63. And so these are the three major players. So you could add Samsung in there in the global 5G space. And so Huawei has a clear market lead there. And there has been many empiricals done by the World Bank and leading economists estimating the impacts of broadband to the economy. And some of these empiricals suggest that for a marginal dollar, in other words, an additional dollar of economic input for a country, if the government puts it in digital infrastructure, the outcome is actually 1.2 times larger than if this dollar was put into traditional infrastructure. And so although roads, rails, ports, these sort of things are still important, these are very much of the infrastructure of the 20th century. But nonetheless, they are important, particularly for the lesser developed emerging economies. But if a country has an opportunity today to develop infrastructure that's geared more towards the 21st century, that money, that next dollar should be put into digital infrastructure. And so 5G was formally launched commercially in China in September of last year. Huawei quickly announced that it was going to 6G infrastructure R&D. And so this year, China aims to install 550,000 5G base stations in China over the next 5 years. And China will own, by 2025, roughly about 40% of the world's 5G population. That'll be a population larger than that of the US and UK 5G users combined. And so 50% of Huawei's 5G commercial contracts are currently earned in Europe. We can see that the UK has allowed Huawei to build 30% of its 5G networks. France and Germany, although still with regulatory constraints, more and more we are hearing that they fear that if Huawei is not used, these countries might fall behind on 5G developments. And so I think Huawei does have a great chance there with these two major European economies. And so once Huawei gets these economies in Europe, we're starting to see a massive China-led digital infrastructure play here, connecting essentially the two ends of Eurasia with one digital standard on one block. And so last year when Mark Zuckerberg deliberated on the launch of Libra in US Congress, his strongest narrative was that, well, China was launching its digital currency. And so the defense of Libra is almost like an antithesis to China's digital currency launch. So Libra was all about defending the liberal ideals of technology, was about defending liberal freedom. And so 2 weeks ago, China started the test pilot its sovereign digital currency in 4 Chinese cities. And in May, just this month, part of the government employees' pay will be paid in sovereign digital currency. And so even more ironically, McDonald's, Subway, Starbucks, these American franchises are among the first participants to actually tender the sovereign digital currency. So where does Libra stand now? The latest I heard is that they're still talking about the launching coins, but instead of launching a singular coin benchmarked on a basket of currencies, now they are launching multiple coins that's benchmarked perhaps more on a singular sovereign currency. And so the project is meeting a lot of hurdles, to say the least. And so why are these Chinese digital developments significant to the world? If we look at the world economic history over millennia, for a very long time, if you would allow me the opportunity to show you this, before, just for the convenience of time, so if everybody can see, this is a world economic chart that basically I charted from year 1600 to 2016. So as we could see, a span of over a millennia, the world looked very, very similar for a very, very long time. Basically, if you look at it from 1600 all the way to about 1750-ish, we really do not really see a lot of changes. And if we extend it further, to year 1000, from year 1000 to 1600, if you are looking at early industrialized economies, including the United Kingdom. You look at ancient agricultural and trade economies, including China and India, the per capita GDP looked very, very similar. And so starting from 1750-ish, we started to see a divergence in terms of the social welfare as gauged by per capita GDP across nations. And so that's what Kuznets basically said. Over a long historical span, the definition of poor countries versus rich countries is actually a very recent phenomenon. And so when looking at that, we understand that over a millennia, it is really, the world hasn't really developed a lot until the past 300 years. And that was really because of the birth of the Industrial Revolution, when we started to see this massive economic takeoff for the North Atlantic industrial regions. And so this income divergence essentially exacerbated, as we saw that chart that is after 1750 just started to drastically take off. That divergence exacerbated with every subsequent round of major industrial revolution in the ensuing 300 years following the following the 1750s, original industrial revolution. And so over that period of time, as the early adopters of technology, the North Atlantic industrial economies started to take off, we actually simultaneously see actually a welfare decline for the rest of the nations in the decades following the Industrial Revolution. And we could see actually, I'm talking about an absolute economic decline. We could see that it happened in export-driven nations at the time, including China, India, and Mexico. And so empirically, we could say by 1770, per capita GDP for China was actually lower than per capita GDP that China had before 1750. And so this time in the 21st century is essentially the first time in world economic history that a global disruptive technology that can potentially trigger massive general levels of technological advancements in AI, IoT, smart city developments that came actually from a developing country and is first adopted also by developing countries. In a newspaper in Cuba, the headline news ran last May that Havana will have 5G before Miami. And I think with Huawei's presence there, it's a genuine possibility. Huawei has developed massively in Africa, the Middle East, the ASEAN nations, and Latin America, a large part of the global South. And so now with the global South as the early adopters of technology, it would bring a comprehensive economic takeoff for the global South against the global industrial North in a way that the world has never seen in its history before. And so it may be the first time that the emerging world will have an opportunity to start narrow this income gap that was developed over the past 300 years against the global North because of technology and because China leads in 5G technology now de facto. So China potentially can lead again in 6G and onwards. And so once this shift of leadership takes place, I think it does have the potential to amplify this leadership by the developing world in the trajectory. And so to me, the paradigm shift in world development economies and the quantum shift it brings for the economic takeoffs from here on, that'll be essentially led by the global South on the back of Chinese technology, is the single most significant global implication that Huawei brings. The second thing I want to talk about sovereign digital currency. China as a emerging market has always had closed capital accounts. So capital cannot freely flow in and out of the border. There is no free capital convertibility either. China is really not so much concerned about capital inflow. As a matter of fact, China welcomes capital inflow, but it's the capital outflow that could potentially cause a financial shock for the economy. And so now with the DCEP, the digital currency that China is aiming to launch and currently pilot testing, when money is digitized, China actually has the potential to trace and track every RMB and its flow via blockchain technology. And so China is now perhaps no longer concerned about capital outflow, and this will allow China the first time to allow capital to freely flow to particularly the Belt and Road regional countries for trade settlements and as an investment currency across the region. So over a period of time, as China continues to push more currency towards through trade and investment mechanisms into the Belt and Road region, the region will be more monetarily integrated with Chinese currency at its core. And so far, we do not see the IMF or SWIFT coming up with either a means to manage China's digital currency or a global governance mechanism on sovereign digital currencies as a whole. And so as China is the first country now launching a major digital currency, it's only natural that China will come up with a set of rules and norms and values to govern this regional digital currency multilateral architecture. And so China has set up regional versions in the past of the World Bank. It's called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. China has set up a regional versions of NATO that's been long established, arguably, back in the, for almost 20 years. It's called Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And now China will be aiming for a parallel version of the IMF on a regional scale. And I think it's only natural over some time that we will see this. And I think this really does also show the fadings of world's multilateral organizations. These things are significant because the 20th century global multilateral order has been and will be replicated by China with its parallel version. And it will usher in a new world order with its rules, games, standards, and agencies, whether over decades, who knows if they will eventually be successful or not, but the efforts is certainly there. And so let me bring you closer to the context of COVID-19. So China is currently using this crisis as a perfect economic opportunity. It's a human tragedy, but the economic opportunity to further digitize the nation. China launched a new digital infrastructure plan currently and still counting upwards with numbers that are just announced across, I believe, currently 24 provinces in China. It's already north of 7 trillion US dollar size. And we started to see a big difference in terms of the economic rescue between the world's two largest economies. US has launched a $3 trillion fiscal rescue package, and now there are discussions there might be another 3 trillion. China, just to be clear, China has not even launched a fiscal rescue package yet. China will possibly by the end of May when the congressional session happens, because fiscal package needs to be approved by the National People's Congress. But so far, China has not done a lot in terms of fiscal rescue and not excessively in monetary rescue either. And so now China has resorted to this very Keynesian way of economic rescue solutions. Keynes, for many people who study economics, this is probably quite classic. And so he basically said in his general theory that if there is a severe aggregate demand shock, what do governments do? They should dig holes, fill holes, dig holes again, and fill holes again. And so that's basically infrastructure building. Arguably, it was about Keynes and the infrastructure expansion that pulled the US out of the Great Depression back in the 1930s. But this time, China is using it and using it massively. It's an infrastructure expansion program, but essentially with a digital twist. And so China will invest in 5G infrastructures, IoTs, Internet of Things, AIs, data centers, smart cities, all the things that will give China not only an opportunity for economic reboot, but essentially a decade of growth opportunities going forward. And so the best investment, as many argue, into the future is really to invest in technology. And the other thing I want to talk about is this major difference that we see. The US has given cash to residents as much as $1,200 a person. And so that's part of the $3 trillion of fiscal rescue package. But China has not given any cash to its residents. And China is an incredible savings nation. The current savings rate in China as of 2019 was 45%. And so if Chinese government does start to give cash to many citizens, a lot of the citizens, I know my parents for sure, would just turn around and deposit it in banks. And so cash absolutely would not work in Chinese scenario. And so China instead has issued the digital coupons. And so I think that is a very pragmatic way to stimulate consumption. As you could see, both China and the US are trying to do and accomplish the same things. But China has resorted to a very different methodology. And so China started to give coupons city by city, started back in March across 40 metropolises or so, and again that continues to expand. And so the advantage for issuing digital coupons for China is that, first of all, it's a fraction of the cost of giving cash, and secondly, it actually has a more significant multiplier effect than cash. By some estimates in China, in tourism sector, which has the highest multiplier effects, for every RMB's worth of digital coupon, actually the actual RMB that's triggered in actual spending, the hard currency that's spent, it's 17 RMB. So it's 17 times more spending than the coupon that's actually issued by the government. But most importantly, by issuing digital coupon, it is actually the traceability that is significant, because by issuing a traceable digital coupon, then the government in China knows exactly who's spending it, where they are spending it, and where it generates the maximum effect. And so that those sort of traceability and big data analytics, it's essential to understand consumer behaviors and how the government should stimulate consumptions going forward. And I think that is the luxury that by simply giving cash in the US, that method wouldn't be able to accomplish. And so not to mention that online education happened very, very quickly in China. I think within a month or so, students were essentially all over the country were wired up. And yesterday, a friend just sent me a video that private schools in the UK now are starting to launch online programs in China. And so the online education space has transformed comprehensively. And lastly, in the video conferencing space, Zoom, where everybody's wired up and where we are currently on right now, it has about 80 or so of its R&D staff in China. Tencent, a Chinese tech company, has recently come up with a video conferencing app called Vogue, and it was just launched in April, but has already gathered steam, and it's already announced officially as the video conferencing partner for the United Nations meeting in June, when essentially all state leaders will be logging on at that very special event. And so as you could see in this video conferencing space where everybody resorts to now for work and socializing, both Voove and Zoom have a significant market exposure and market integration with China. And so this whole digitization process is happening in a massive way in China in many different areas. And I think if it's done correctly from both the investment and application side, digital infrastructure spending will give China an opportunity in the current decade to not only revive the economy, but also the opportunity to potentially take the developing world along with it. And so I think I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yu. I have probably a dozen or so questions, and I don't have that much time, but very, very insightful. And you and I have had various conversations about this China, EU, US sort of relationships, and the fact that there is a great deal of anti-propaganda. And I think one from the Western viewpoint has to understand when there's such a major force such as China gathers the momentum, looks like it's using COVID-19 as a great economical opportunity and the opportunity to advance its agenda worldwide, politically and economically. There's going to be inevitable backlash, there's going to be inevitable negative sort of media and somewhat propaganda used against it. Now, you mentioned Huawei and 5G as well as the digital currency. And what struck me is something that I've discussed with other people over the past year or so, as somebody who's been kind of back and forth to China over the past couple of decades, who's really understood the Chinese mindset, in the sense of the ambition that goes beyond the Chinese interest, which isn't always the case for the Western world and the Western powers. They have the tendency to sort of propel through realpolitik their own agenda, their own interest, and often at the expense of those others on the other side. I just feel that what you said about potential democratization of the wealth distribution and the assistance of the towards the developing world, in particular with the 5G and 6G technology, is going to perhaps bring that graph that you talked about, where really last 200 or 300 years have seen a huge disparity between the wealthy and non-wealthy, or the rich and poor, at the forefront. How do you think China, and what are going to be the main sort of barriers for the Chinese to see through what I feel might be, of course, new world order, but a lot more beneficial one than we've seen so far, where the kind of the Western powers have been at the forefront, and China has really only emerged powerful in the last 20 or 30 years. What are going to be the barriers of entry, in your opinion? And what are going to be the ultimate benefits when it comes down to the technology transfer and the sort of equipping the developing world that struggled for centuries now to actually leapfrog all the things they missed over the past 100, 200 years and become more self-sustainable, more self-efficient? We spoke to Dr. Cornelia Mayer last week about the whole world economy becoming more regional. I think you mentioned the regional aspects of the IMF, NATO, and United Nations that China has already put together. You mentioned the online and the edtech, and education hasn't been transformed for millenniums, and this is an opportunity to transform the education and sort of food processing. So lots of kind of things there, but I'd love to hear your view on that.
Well, Samir, first of all, I want to say that if we look at, I like to take a long historical view, like because if we look at the world development history, we could say in terms of factors of production, there are labor, capital, technology fundamentally, and now increasingly data. I think the world, the economic world at least, still hasn't really figured out exactly how data will become a fundamental factor of production in terms of generating economic output. But I think China, starting from 2019, has come up with essential policy documents that essentially list data as a major factor of production, along with the likes of capital, land, etc. And so I think that transforms into what the Western world speculates that we might be entering into an age of data capitalism. So we don't yet know. There are many, many things that are in transit, not only politically in terms of world order, but also economically in terms of where capitalism is heading. So I think technology fundamentally will be the driver of the next wave of economic growth. And if we look at today, we are sort of, economic activities, productivity has been declining not only in developed world. We haven't seen a significant productivity increase in the developing world either. And so technology is the only possibility, I think, to generate that impetus and momentum to give the world economic growth another significant leg up. And I think, that we are looking at the possibilities coming out of the global disruptive technological space. And I think Huawei and the 5G technology that it's a part of, along with other players, may potentially bring the world to a level where it creates the infrastructure for AIs, smart cities, Internet of Things, where everything is connected. It's not 5G itself necessarily that is industrial revolutionary like. It's not technology as significant as the steam engine for sure, but the possibility that it enables other technologies to flourish might create something to that effect in the future. And so then we have to look at this technology. Whoever adopts the technology early on will have this economic takeoff. And so if we just look at factually, today, it is the developing world that are actually adopting the technology. You know why? Because countries that are poorer, they don't care near as much about cybersecurity, data privacy issues as much as the developed world. And so in a way, there's less barrier to entry in the developing world to have these sort of 5G cutting edge technology. And so they become the early adopters. And I think it's inevitable once they adopt early, and then that economic takeoff effect will naturally happen in these economies. And then essentially, I think the world trajectory will fundamentally shift. And so this is really not by political design. I think it is just some fundamental economics and how the development patterns between the global north and south have fundamentally shifted this time around. And the other thing I want to talk about is for China's, you talked about China's transition in building a architecture with what it has. I think a lot of times, we have one thing I think we know for sure is that we have left the old world normal, that whole age of globalization where economies are working together. There is a strong level of coordination. Back in 2008, China was a major coordinating partner in resolving the global financial crisis at the time. And so you could say that China with 4 trillion RMB's monetary stimulus at the time has really helped significantly to pull the world out of the Great Recession. But this time around, we do not see either strong levels of coordination in the public health side or the financial rescue side. And so there is, again, a lesser willingness for these, global multilateral frameworks to work together. And so then I think we are in shifts for sure, but we haven't really come to a new global normal. So we are moving from one equilibrium, moving into a disequilibrium, and perhaps moving into another one. No one knows for sure how it's going to look like. And look, China, not necessarily as the second largest economy, I think, and the natural way that it's built through this Belt and Road Initiative, primarily driven by the large developing world. I think it's going to have the developing world's partnership with it. And so that's all natural forces, I think, that are currently at play here. I could not say for sure that China is mapping out a plan today and say who's in and who's out. I don't think that's the case.
Okay, and obviously, clearly, many would say that China is being very opportunistic when it comes down to entering of the developing world, because it is easier to enter the world that's poorer and that needs your economical and the investments of infrastructure and support more than you will find with the developed world that sees you as the direct competitor. And we know that currency exchange is what's ruled the world for many, many decades and centuries now. So with the digitalization of the currency that China has recently launched, and I have many friends who have taken advantage of moving digital currency and moving money from China into Europe and America literally within the matter of minutes, which would normally take a traditional banks between China and the United States or United Kingdom days of compliance and due diligence and KYC. So it's a really the parallel system that's been created through the digital currency that's allowing the inflow and outflow of the currency from China, which has traditionally been a very, very difficult thing. But if we pick the region of the Western Balkans, and we've discussed this relationship between China, European Union and the Balkans, and the fact that China has become probably the most significant, and if not the most important investment partner with all the countries from the Balkans region as the latest entrant. Because if we go back 30 years and the war in Yugoslavia, and the fact that the Americans came in to kind of almost seal the deal and finish and end the war with the Dayton Peace Accords. The Russians have always been there, but more recently the Chinese have gone in a very clever way with the infrastructural project and the sort of soft policy arrangement that will probably see that relationship, that bridge for the decades to come. you know, how do you answer all critics that are coming from the West and somewhat in a very propaganda-driven way, that China isn't in it to just score brownie points and bring on board as many countries around the world as they can, but they genuinely want to do the good for the nations that need assistance. Of course, it's the capitalism we live in, so the Chinese also want to make money in the process and return their investment on capital, whether it's a human or financial. You know, what's your kind of view on that?
I don't think any country will do major, massive investments in terms of the BRI investment. It's closer to $1 trillion now since 2013. I don't think any country will be doing $1 trillion investment out of altruism. It's just, it's unpractical. And so I don't think the world should see China that way. China says it. I think it is, in a way, a very mercantilist way of looking at global investment and the global trade. It's that, it's about, as China said, it's about win-win. And so I think on one hand, it's like, let's not think of China as God. I've been asked over the past years, China isn't putting investments in lesser developed countries, but China is not creating jobs, China is not buying the products, China is not doing this, China is not doing that. I say to them, well, look, China is not God. Countries have to economically, come up with solutions and grow and reform. It's their responsibility. And so on the other hand, I'm not here to defend China in any way. Say, for example, in the current COVID-19 crisis, a lot of the European economies, big and small, they have had quality issues with China's face masks. Well, if there are face masks, if there are poor quality products in normal times, I think it's bad reputation, but it doesn't hurt human lives. But today, if, it means lives on the line. If a doctor in a hospital trying to save lives and wearing a poor quality mask, it's dangerous. It puts his or her life in a harm's way. So I think those are particularly bad situations. And I think when things like this happen, of course, I'm not here to judge if they are just said to be poor quality or they are actually poor quality. But nonetheless, I think countries do have a reason to talk about these things. And so I don't want to say that I'm here to tell countries, China's good or wrong. I don't think that's the case. But then I think for every respective country, the country's leaders, businesses, entrepreneurs, people who run respective countries, they should come up with a wise decision. Do they want to work with China? Do they not want to work with China? And I think it's fundamentally up to them. And in a democracy, up to the people. In a non-democracy, up to the political leaders to make that sort of decisions. Certainly, I think it's lesser in China's hand than in respective countries' hands.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, I have a couple more questions, but I think I'm going to hand it over now to Tatiana to get some questions from the audience. And then we will I'll come in if I pick up on anything that's interesting to probe you further. Tatiana, over to you.
Thank you, Samir. Thank you, Shirley. And yeah, we have a couple of questions already. And I will start with a question about the luxury industry. And this question to all panelists. So China was expected to share 40–65% of the global luxury industry by 2025. In your opinion, will Chinese affluent consumer body remain its hungry for luxury purchase after COVID-19? And how brands appeal to the new Chinese consumer under these circumstances? So, Shirley, you can start.
That's a great question, actually, because, obviously women love luxury brands. But, well, if you are based in Europe, you probably have been seeing the Chinese shop everywhere in, right, in London, Paris, Milan, all the best shopping districts in the world. So China, let me just give you some macro demographics. So China has currently, by some economic estimate, 400 million middle income earners. And that's before COVID-19. And in 10–15 years time, that's number is supposed to double to 800 million middle income earners. And so when we are talking about this 800 million strong power of consumption, that is a huge force, right? It's almost more than 2 times of the entire population of the United States. And so when a brand that does capture the hearts and minds of this massive middle income class in China, it has a lot of potential to take off. But at the same time, it's a double-edged sword. I wanted to say, if you remember last year, from Versace to Coach, I think Tiffany as well, they all sort of got severe backlash in China. Oh, D&G is a Dolce & Gabbana is another one. And so they had a series of reputational faults in China, particularly by Chinese consumers, because of sensitive issues. I think they all apologized afterwards, and Chinese did. I think that was over a period, a couple of weeks or so. But if you look at NBA, that was a particularly bad case. Chinese love basketball, and because of one particular person working for the NBA, and what he said on social media, just 7 words, it's caused severe damage, and air rights were canceled, and games were canceled. And so I think luxury brands entering into Chinese market today, because of I should say the profit aspect of it, they have to be extra careful and culturally sensitive about Chinese market as well. And in a way, these brands have been used to growing in the developed world, and Chinese does have a lot of particular cultural sensitivity that the Western brands don't really know much about. And so I just started to see these tragedies one after another. And I think we ought to avert those. We have to stop these tragedies, and that I think starts from the board level and the founders of these luxury brands to really hire the best advisors and board members on their team to really teach a little bit of the cultural elements of entering into China market. And so I think it's huge potential, but also at the same time, as we have seen, if brands don't do well, it's a huge backlash as well.
I agree with Dr. Yu in the sense of I think the Western world needs more education, and I don't know how many tragedies we have to go through for them to understand the cultural sensitivity of China. When you do business between, call it the West and East, often, probably 9 out of 10 times, the deals fall through because of the cultural differences and the fact that either side or both sides haven't really done their homework and haven't really got the best advice or hired the best advisors to really take them through that journey of negotiations. And social media is incredibly powerful these days, and what the board members and the CEOs of various companies are underestimating, that if they make an announcement on social media in Europe, that will get to China in a matter of seconds. And you can't be expecting to be entering the biggest and most lucrative market in the world and not show your consumer over there the utmost respect. I mean, that's got to go. And I'm all for these brands having huge reputational damage and even being wiped out in terms of given the opportunity, because they all talk about the importance of entering the Chinese market. But do they really do enough to entertain it in the right way? Do they really invest enough to actually keep that as a long-term plan and strategy, where Europe has struggled with luxury now for a long time? There's a very small percentage of the elites in Europe that are even entertaining spending thousands of pounds a month or a week or a day on the luxury, whereas the Chinese are really becoming incredibly sophisticated in terms of their own taste level. They're adopting their own style. Their fashion weeks have really shot through the roof, and I've seen that with the relationships they've forged recently with the British Fashion Council and the London Fashion Week. I've also seen the likes of David and Victoria Beckham really being the great ambassadors of China, UK in particular, bridge when it comes down to fashion. And what I think we will see after COVID-19, we will see some new winners when it comes down to the luxury sector. I think lots of brands that have been overlooked, lots of brands that have been underinvested. The Chinese love the heritage and the tradition of Europe, you know, something that isn't yet there, because it's an old nation with a huge heritage and a huge tradition that had gone through sort of 100 years of a slightly different sort of economical development and different regime position. So it's really coming back to its core. That's how I see it, and that's why I've seen the Chinese kind of comeback rather than sort of appearance over the past sort of 20 years. So I think all Western world must take China into the equation of not just success, but also survival. I think they have to play the cultural sort of sensitivity game much, much better. And the Chinese are, you know, sophisticated consumers who are no fools. So if you try to offer them something that isn't what it says on the tin, they will reject it and not really support it. However, if you offer them something that's interesting, that's exciting, that's a crossover between art and fashion and design, as Dr. Yu mentioned, entertainment is huge. NBA, football is becoming massive in China. President Xi has really given the Chinese Football Association the mandate to help the Chinese Super League improve, not to spend any more millions of pounds on the old players who are finishing their career to end with a huge paychecks in China. There's been now caps on how much you can pay a foreign or national player, because they really want the longevity and success of the sport. Chinese nation has got a lot to learn from Japan in terms of their success in the sporting industry. Japanese is a much smaller nation, has had football, especially at a very, very high level for quite a few decades now. But I think, and I feel now the Chinese are looking at everything in a very, very different way. And it's nothing to do with the fact they've become more economically powerful. I think they've learned, I think they've done a great strategy of sending the second and third generation kids to be educated in the United States and the United Kingdom and in Europe. These young individuals from, Dr. Yu will know, the London School of Economics, Imperial, all the top London and UK universities are really understanding the way in which the bridge will work, and they are becoming the great ambassadors of China when it comes down to investment and the rest of the world. So I'm actually very excited about the luxury sector, which in Europe will struggle, in America will struggle, but I think in China will flourish.
Thank you very much. That's my favorite topic. So thank you for your answers. But then we will move to the 5 and 6G. I have two questions here. It's a bit similar, but from different angles. So one is related to Africa and another is related to India. So the first question is, Dr. Shirley Yu talking about 5G and technology and China's relationship with Europe, USA, and UAE. What are the plans China has to Africa as far as technology and 5G is concerned? That's the first question. And the second question, it's about India from Janil. As much as China wants to extend its influence over Western countries through various technological advances such as 5G and 6G in the near future, do you think the fundamental communism structure of the Chinese government, which is very much different from that of the democratic Western countries that is tried to influence, will be a barrier? Are other emerging democratic countries such as India better structured political to win the trust and faith of these Western countries, especially post-COVID-19 situation when transparency of information coming out from China comes under question? So kind of different questions, but related to 5G and 6G.
Right. First on Africa, well, in China, we have never heard of a smartphone's name called Techno. And I just came to know when the company went IPO that it actually owns 40% of Africa's market share. It's incredible. And I think at one point in time, Huawei even sued this company that's also headquartered in Shenzhen on some copyright infringements. And so for Africa, this phone brand, to me, it's amazing that in the sense that they sell zero domestically inside China, but it's, they've specifically designed a phone that are suitable for the lesser developing countries out there in Africa and in Asia. And so I think that really leads to a supply chain recalibration that as we see now globally, as post-COVID-19, we're talking about a lot of the supply chain will be recalibrated even at a more exacerbated speed. Developed world will likely move supply chains closer to home, especially for the high-end manufacturing and items, the production of vital national security. But at the same time, for China, what it means is that for a large ASEAN economy, Africa economy out there, and China probably will continue to rebuild its supply chains and its downstream supply chain. So what we are seeing in China is a natural industrial growth curve that happens to an economy that are in the modernization process. And so China has started as a world factory, started with quite a low end and the medium end of manufacturing capacity. And so now as China starts to move to technology, and then China naturally, I think it's just a matter of time that will naturally, because it's no longer a cost-efficient economy to produce, say, for example, toys and matches and things like that. And so essentially, it'll move to more labor-intensive and more younger economies within the region. And I think Africa and ASEAN do have quite a lot to capture in that sense. And then Chinese technology, as it continues to move upwards, and of course it offers an option for Africa. But I think by and large, Africa is hugely diversified. China is a large investor in Africa. We all know that. China currently owns $143 billion of loans to Africa. China singularly represents 20% of Africa's total debt. And so in terms of the investment flow, China is undoubtedly a huge player. In terms of technological flow, I think we can capture, the smartphone company that I talked about. We can say Huawei is a big player there, but by and large by market forces. And I think this supply chain recalibration will start to take effect by market forces and naturally in Africa over a long period of time. And then the other question is on India, and of course, fundamentally about the political systems. I think this tech decoupling is real, and it'll become more complicated going forward. And say, for example, on my computer, I currently have WhatsApp, I have WeChat, I have TikTok in China and TikTok outside of China. I have Zoom, Vogue, I have essentially Chinese versions of everything that we use in terms of social media. And sometimes I ask my Chinese friends, I say, is there a point of convergence of, because of the barrier, that essentially decouples the technological world between China and people who don't necessarily associate with China. There are two sets of everything for global citizens today. And so I think those are complicated for a business person to manage. But then I think that is a reality. Again, I do not get a sense that there is anybody who are smart enough today to say there is actually a convergence possibility, say, for example, between Facebook and the Chinese Weibo. No one that I have talked with actually see that happen. And so we have to take it as a reality. And so that, again, goes back to what Mark Zuckerberg said. Does technology actually carry value? That's a very, very complicated question. I think people, as these sort of different ecosystems starts to develop with China and the Silicon Valley at its center, I think people will make choices, conscious choices, and nations will. And again, it's really up to them. And say, for example, if let's say, on the Huawei issue, if Germany does say, we want Huawei to participate in our 5G network, and the next, chancellor comes in, and maybe decisions will change. Those are all possibilities. Like in the UK, when people wanted to ask for Brexit, what did people do? They had a referendum, and they actually changed the government in order to implement the people's wills. And if the people's wills are so strong, in countries, particularly democracies in the West. And so I think sooner or later, people's decision will create effects in those countries. And I think it's really, really hard to say at this point in time, what are the decisions today will be permanently the decision forever.
Thank you very much. And the next question is about the soft power. How is China extending its soft power, culture, language, etc., across emerging markets, and what are its consequences in terms of geopolitics and the change of the existing new world order?
This is a very interesting topic, actually. So let me bring you to two perspectives. So first of all, China, what China is doing. And so last year, China announced with 50, I believe, 50 African leaders were in China for the China-Africa Summit. And then Chinese President Xi announced that China will give up to, I believe, 50,000 scholarships to African scholars. And so many African students, they came to China. If you look at Chinese top-tier universities all over the country, in Peking University, Tsinghua, for example, you see a lot of African university students there. And so when they come to China, they study anywhere from Confucianism to Xi Jinping thought. And so I think that is significant because in 20 years' time, these people will become the future leaders of Africa. And when they come into power in 20 years' time, they would naturally have an affiliation and understanding of Chinese culture. And I think in a way, that is how soft power is planted. And then when they are in decision-making capacity, they would actually relate more to Confucian thoughts and Xi Jinping thoughts than to Immanuel Kant and Plato. And I think that is a significant change at that point in time, a couple of decades on, that they would actually, that soft power affiliation, I think it's going to be phenomenal in terms of developing bilateral understandings and bilateral relations. But on the other hand, if you look at the Chinese elites, for the past 4 decades, most of the Chinese elites, they preferred to send their children to the US or the UK, to a smaller extent, other European and Australian universities to study. And so for the past 4 decades, you look at a lot of the resumes of top Chinese ministers, political top bureaucrats, I should say, a lot of them have had an overseas education background. And this chief trade negotiator, Liu He, Vice Premier Liu, he was educated in Harvard. And so you could say that for the past 40 years, it was the American educated Chinese who have contributed significantly to China's reform and opening up process. But now, because of the US-China trade war, there is a educational decoupling between China and the US. And if you look at a lot of Chinese elites today and you ask them, where do you want to send your children to university? And they would be concerned to send their children a lot of times to the US now. And so they opt for the UK for their children's education. So I could say that from my personal experience, I've been seeing more and more Chinese elites sending their children to the UK, which means a fantastic opportunity for UK universities. But again, we have to think forward to 20 years' time, that in 20 years, the next generation, perhaps the next generation of Chinese leaders will connect more closely with the UK. That's in a way, that's never happened in contemporary Chinese, the past 4 decades of experience, because it was by and large the American crowd, I should say. And so I think gradually those soft powers are significant in the sense, not only China will have bigger soft power in the emerging market, but also I think UK and perhaps other European economies will have a bigger soft power influence to China as well.
Could I just add, Tatiana, the very important element that Dr. Yu talked about, the education. I think art forms, in particular the Chinese calligraphy, I'm seeing gaining more and more momentum, and Chinese art in general, contemporary art, which has been pretty underrepresented in London, I must say. In Paris more so, because there's the Levy family, I think, holds one of the biggest collections of contemporary Chinese in the world. And both Sylvain and Dominique Levy, the couple behind the collection, sent both of their children to China for a few years, and both of them speak perfect Mandarin. They got educated there, and they really brought that the kind of Chinese perspective that Dr. Yu is talking about, the Africans going and being educated in China. So when they get into the position of power, their affiliation is more likely to be towards Chinese way of call it the positive globalization than the American way. And I see that calligraphy sort of impact it's had on the Rockefeller family in New York. The Rockefellers are big fans and practitioners of calligraphy, and they've staged some amazing calligraphy exhibitions. And, you know, I happen to be lucky and privileged to have come across the master that works very closely with them and the political elites of China, with whom we are developing this bridge between China and Europe when it comes down to the introduction of calligraphy, not just as an art form, but as a sort of, you know, the traditional and the heritage-driven form of China. So I think we will see more art exchanges. I have a number of friends that have launched art fairs and art galleries across China with the sort of exchange program at its forefront between China and the rest of the world. And I'm sort of quite excited to see how that all evolves.
Thank you. I have two more questions, one to Dr. Yu and one to Samir. So, Dr. Yu, the question is actually related to Africans in China, but it's a more sensitive question. So during this coronavirus pandemic, there have been videos trending on social media of some Africans being treated poorly on the streets on the guise that they are the ones spreading the coronavirus pandemic, and that this have both mixed feeling amongst the Africans. I know the Chinese people are very good people. So Dr. Yu, what special measures in the government of China taken to resolve this issue?
Well, I think China has tried from the diplomatic circles, at least, you know, Chinese diplomats, to try to reconciliate the issue. Without being in Guangzhou myself, you know, seeing some videos sporadically, I must say, though, you know, we should treat everybody equal, you know, within China. China does have, you know, I think a fairly good track record over the past 40 years about respecting foreign expats in China. China doesn't have a particular issue with, you know, sort of resentment towards foreign expats in China. And so as a friendly nation, I think China ought to protect that reputation and do really well. And if there are any instances where, you know, this sort of acts become more systemic, I would say, you know, that's a major issue. But if it was sporadic in the spur of the moment in terms of emergency, I think what China is trying to do, and what I understand, is that the diplomats, you know, that China sends all over the world, is trying to reconciliate with African countries. And so we just have to see. I don't see much more happening now, but if there are more happening, I'm sure we will know. And for sure, you know, that's an issue that needs to be resolved.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. Samir, we have a question about the Mayfair Investment Club. So Mohammed asks, my friend attended your talk at Regents. Can you please share what the Mayfair Investment Club entry fee and how can you join? And does club offer possibility investments partnership with Chinese guides? Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed, for the question. Frankly speaking, at the board level, we are still discussing the entry requirements. Mostly, we're initially looking at this $500,000 to $2 million investment commitment by each member. That will be either invited or go through the very, very sort of a rough, tough due diligence process and the KYC process. Just we want to attract the right quality of members. We're currently discussing it to go up to 2 to 5 million. purely because, yes, many have said that we're building an elite club, and it is true. I mean, we're not going to pretend that that's going to be club for all. Yes, we are aiming to get 250 most powerful families and their offsprings and the next generation as the members of the club, because for two reasons. The club has actually a mission rather than becoming yet another club. We are going to be promoting and introducing philanthropy as a very, very important element of the sort of wealthy families around the world. We're going to be promoting social impact and impact investment, that with the money that one earns, with this return on investment that they achieve, they also have a responsibility towards those who are less privileged. And for that reason, the Mayfair Investment Club is in parallel setting up a foundation that will run in same direction of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We will not be a very sort of pedantic and insisting on every investment having the social impact, because it's impossible. I think sustainable investment today has to be sustainable in terms of return on investment, as well as impactful when it comes down to the local community, the society, and the market that it actually penetrates. So to get involved, we are in the final stages of defining the entry criteria. As I mentioned, it's going to be a minimum requirement of 2 to 5 million investment committed towards the building of the investment portfolio. We are looking only for the very, very ambitious young individuals in the age bracket of 18 to 30 who have gone through the higher education or in the process of education in London, Europe, and around the world, who aren't interested in building their own businesses, but are very much interested in becoming successful and seasoned investors. It's a very different mindset to running your own business to becoming an investor. And we will continue with the search and the quest. And we are not in a hurry to have 250 members, which is our mission with London, before we scale the club globally. We really want to focus on the quality of those individuals that will come. The club will have no social media presence. For a reason of the fact that we're not here to show everyone what each member does. The events that we will do will have no mobile phones allowed at them, because we really want to work on the future leaders of tomorrow. We really want to very much alongside the lines what China is doing around the world with various economical, social, and investment opportunities and infrastructures to go down the road of the sustainable, long-term, positive impact on the world at large. And we'd like to think that the club will play a very, very significant role in that.
Thank you, Samir. So we have two more questions about the soft power. So I'm asking you, Dr. Yu and Samir, if you have some extra time to answer those questions. Are you okay with it? Yeah? Okay, so the first question is, in speaking more about soft power, the US greatly helped various nations defend their sovereignty during the First and Second World Wars, including China in World War II against Japan. The humanitarian, economic, global peace impact of American policy is tremendous. Is China ready to play such a role?
That's a fantastic question. I was actually going to pick it up. I think, you know, for America to establish what's called the Pax Americana for the 20th century, to essentially establish not only the global multilateral organisms, but also global defense and install global peace and prosperity. That was tremendous amount of sacrifice. And I remember at one meeting a couple of years ago with a very senior former national security advisor of the United States. And one thing that the person said really resonated big time in my mind. And basically the words is that, you know, if China wants to become a global leader, you know, let them have a try, because until they become one, they don't really understand the pains and the sacrifices it takes to be a global leader. And I think I 100% agree with you. The US did not become a global leader by not sacrificing in the most atrocious way for freedom in the 20th century. And that should forever be remembered. And I think China today is an economic power. And as many people have talked about, China needs to learn how to build the soft power, because global leadership one day, if China does want to get there, global leadership is first and foremost about sacrifice. It's not about win-win. And a lot of times in this COVID situation, as we have seen, it's really, there is no win-win. It has to take some sacrifices from the leadership in order to benefit the greater humanity. And so I think in many instances going forward, I think China does, if China wants to assume and aspire for that sort of position. I'm not sure if China does want to, nothing has been said clearly on paper. I'm just saying if China wants to, leadership involves pains and sacrifice.
Thank you very much. And the second question is, building upon Dr. Yu's remarks on China's soft power cultural exploration, how do you think China will react to the importation of Western culture, given the increased amount of young people receiving Western education? Do you think that there will be a shift in China's political atmosphere?
I think, for the first generation of Chinese students who went to the United States, I think was right after Nixon's visit. That was back in the early 1980s. And so that's been, let's count roughly about 40 years now. China's political system is very unique in a way, but not that it's static. If you look at Chinese generational leadership transformation, China has politically, it's a one-party system that's never changed, but actually from one leader to another, if you look at China with a sort of a microscope, you could actually see quite a lot of policy undercurrents that have been changing and adapting itself. And so all political systems will inevitably have to do that. And going forward, how elastic is that system, and how will Chinese political system adapt to the new economic environment and global environment? We have to wait and see. But what I can say is that in 2020, when we look at China's political economic architecture, that's very, very different from what it was back in 2010.
Thank you very much. And the last question, I promise. So what are the side effects or negative consequences of 5G technology, to Dr. Yu?
I wouldn't be able to answer because, I'm not a technologist. I always tell people, with side effects, you mean like what the people are speculating to health and so forth. I should say that I'm really in no position to comment on that.
Thank you very much. I think that's all. Dr. Yu, thank you for your expertise. There was an amazing time spending together. Samir, thank you very much for organizing all of this. So for attendees, thank you for being with us. 1 hour, 15 minutes, 14 minutes to be fair. And you will all get the follow-up link with the video of today's webinar. So have a lovely weekend. Thank you. And see you soon.
Thank you so
much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.